Welcome to Unlocking Potential, a Red Door Pediatric Therapy podcast. We're your hosts, Heather and Kelli.
With master's degrees in speech-language pathology and decades of pediatric experience, we've been the co-owners of Red Door Pediatric Therapy since 2006.
On this podcast, we share stories and strategies that can unlock the potential of functional, behavioral, emotional, and social development in children today.
Today's guests are Geena, Schmidt, and Erin, Imsland, occupational therapists at Red Door Pediatric Therapy.
Welcome to this episode. We're talking about an exciting topic, which is sensory processing, and we're joined by Erin and Geena. Erin, I'm going to let you introduce yourself first.
I'm Erin Imsland. I'm an occupational therapist, and I've been working at Red Door for 6 years, almost 6 years.
My name's Geena Schmidt. I'm an occupational therapist here in our Minot clinic, and I've been with Red Door for 5 years.
Sensory processing can affect a lot of kids and families, and not everybody knows what those words even mean. So kind of out the gate, what is sensory processing?
So when we're talking about sensory processing, we're talking about how people, kids, adults, everybody, understands and interprets the information outside of us in our environment, the things we see, smell, taste, touch, hear, but then also the information within our bodies, how we're feeling, how hot we are, how we're moving. It really encompasses all of those sensations.
And we kind of talk about it in a way where some things that may not bother you might bother me. The tag on your shirt might not bother you, but it might bother me. I talked to Kelli a lot about the lights at Red Door. This light doesn't bother her, but that light sure does bother me. And so, Geena, what else can kind of be affected, or how else can this affect kids?
Oh, for sure. You mentioned light, but what about sound? Some things are not so loud for other people, but other people, it's just earth shattering. Some smells, we're not noticing if people are cooking, but other people are 3 rooms away and it's impacting them. So all of those 5 senses can really take a huge part in interpreting our environments.
So what brain and body systems are involved with sensory processing?
Well, when we're talking about each of our systems, they have receptors all over our body. So taste, for example, those receptors are on our tongue. So that's where we get the information, and then it goes up to our brain, and then that's when we figure out what to do with it. And you or I don't have to think that much about what we're going to do with that information. It just happens and we move on. But a lot of kids who are struggling with sensory processing skills and systems, they have to think a lot about that information, or they're getting bad information. They're getting information that those sounds that are just normal sounds are scary or unsafe, when really they're not. But then now we're talking about kids not being able to engage in their environments. They can't go to loud events. They can't be at the grocery store or at restaurants with their families. And parents are having to make a lot of accommodations for these kids because they're getting bad information from their sensory systems.
So how would a parent know if it was sort of just a quirk or a sensitivity, or just something that we all have in terms of sensory information, or something more going on with their sensory system, something more going on with how they process sensory information? What are sort of some lines in the sand that you see?
For sure. And I think it's really important to know that everyone's sensory system is unique. So there's not the right way to interact with it and the wrong way to interact. There's a really wide continuum. But what we want is when kids interact with their environment, they're able to adapt or cope. So if it's really a hard thing and you can't go to certain environments or do certain things, that's when it's really impacting function. And that's when we can get OT on board, just to make life easier for the child and family as a whole.
What kind of effects do you see from a system that maybe is not working properly? Like, what are some outward signs that seem obvious?
So if we talk about our touch system, those receptors are located in our skin. And if you think about getting ready in the morning, there is so much input to your skin. You are brushing your hair, you're putting on your clothes, you might be taking a bath or shower in the morning, you're brushing your teeth. All of these things, that's a bunch of sensory input to your tactile or touch system. These kids are going to fight those tasks. You are going to have rough mornings every morning. You're going to be exhausted by the time you get these kids to school. So they might, say that these things hurt them. They might change their clothes 17 times every morning, or you only can buy one pair of pants and that's it. And if those pants are dirty, then you are not wearing pants that day.
The world comes crashing down.
And that's it. So that would be a common one to see, is just a lot of fighting with daily tasks, and then a lot of avoiding of things, avoiding of brushing teeth, avoiding of wearing different clothing textures.
So someone might feel like their kid just doesn't have great hygiene, or their teacher might be like, ugh, he's got to brush his teeth in the morning, or might notice things like that. And it isn't just that he doesn't have great hygiene. It's maybe something more is going on.
Definitely. And, or, they might think it's an emotional piece, like, my kid won't cooperate. Like, my kid is just fighting me on all. Yes, exactly. And really, those behaviors are coming from an underlying sensory issue.
I think we often see it with attention or arousal. Oh, my child is bouncing off the walls. They just don't slow down. Well, that's another one of those hidden sensory systems that go beyond touch and smell, taste, vision, and hearing. That's our vestibular input, that knowing which way is up in the world, and proprioceptive input, the pressure to our joints. Some kids just need a little bit more in their cup in order to get calm. So finding some really nice, safe ways to do that. And we see that attention and arousal improve significantly with the right strategies.
So on the flip side, it's obvious when they're having some of that overstimulation, but what about if they are under responsive?
It will also be obvious. These kids are going to be jumping off the couch. They are going to be bumping into their friends. They are going to be, Geena used a cup analogy. She talked about filling the cup. So if we think about kids who are under responsive, they have a really big sensory cup and they need a lot of input to fill it. So if there's not noise in their environment, they'll make some. They'll be humming or talking to themselves. If there's not movement involved with the activity, they'll make some. They'll walk around their desk. They will reposition themselves 1,000 times. They're not going to be sitting still in their chair. So that would be kind of the other end of the spectrum, where you're going to see them seeking out as much sensory input as they can get to make their body feel good.
This is great information for educators too, because oftentimes when we have sort of a relationship with a child at Red Door, and perhaps you collaborate with their teacher or people at school, they're like, I mean, yeah, he fell out of his desk 6 times today, but otherwise good. And you're like, well, I don't know about that. And so some of that kind of plays into this, how they do at school, not necessarily academically, but how they tolerate kind of a long day at school can certainly be impacted by this. Would that be right?
Heather, you make a really good point on the other side. We talk about our fast and loud kids, but what about those kids that barely move and they're in their chair and you're wondering if they're even awake? They're trying to avoid that movement because they know they can't take too much. And they're just trying to autopilot and make it through. So we want to see those kids that look like they're lazy or falling asleep as well, because there's things we can do to help them.
So if a parent was listening and they felt like, okay, this is absolutely my kid, I didn't realize that this sort of was all that went into it. How do they get started? What does an initial assessment with regard to sensory processing look like from an occupational therapy point of view?
Typically, families will fill out like a sensory questionnaire of sorts that will give us a good idea of each system or what kind of sensory difficulty we're seeing. Do they have that big cup that needs lots and lots and lots of input to be filled, or do they have a small cup where any amount of input is sending them into that fight or flight and avoidance strategies? So we start with that, and just to get the basic information, and then we'll go into their daily life and we'll talk about every single activity that kid is supposed to do in that day and what sensory difficulty might be impacting them from participating, because really the goal is that these kids are participating in their life. And if there's a sensory concern that's impacting that, that's kind of where we want to get to that underlying difficulty.
We've talked a lot about school-age kids, but how would a parent notice this in younger kids, or would they still sort of take it as seriously in younger kids?
Yeah, we see it in infancy as well. These are the fussy kids. They're hard to calm. They're often upset, or sometimes they're the really easy babies. And you're like, this seems almost too good to be true. So a lot of those characteristics we see in other ways. We have other measures to assess that and interview. They're eating great. They are sleeping well. They may be playing a ton or hardly move around. So there's just high variables with each of those.
So for kids who don't demonstrate sensory processing issues or difficulties, that's typical. There shouldn't be a lot of bumps. I mean, we've talked about sort of that we all have sensitivities, and we all come with our certain sort of things that we notice about ourselves or other people. But what is considered typical and what is considered not typical?
Yeah. And I think the bumps in the road is a good way to put it. These kids whose sensory processing systems are working well are just able to do their life. They're able to get ready in the morning. They're able to, go to a movie theater or a restaurant. They're able to play with their peers and not have a lot of roadblocks that are interfering, and also aren't having a lot of strategies from adults to get them to be able to participate. A lot of times these families will say, oh, they can go to a restaurant, but we do X, Y, Z every single time so that they can be successful. Well, you're making so many accommodations for them because of their sensory processing systems that you don't even realize you're doing just because you're trying to make your kid successful. But that's probably a good red flag to be like, if I'm making all of these, what about their next environment, preschool, daycare, when they don't have an adult to make all these accommodations for them?
Less controlled environment.
Yeah.
You two as occupational therapists often refer to a pyramid when we're talking about sensory processing. Can you talk a little bit about what that pyramid is?
It looks a lot like Maslow's triangle, honestly, with that big part being at the bottom, knowing that what the start of sensory processing is our central nervous system. It's our spine and our brain talking efficiently and effectively to each other to problem solve. So that's where those 5 common senses live, as well as what we've touched on of vestibular, proprioceptive, as well as interoception. That's all the stuff that's going on inside our body. If we need to have a bowel movement or empty our bladder, if we're hungry or full, if we are cold or hot, if our heart is beating fast or slow, if our breathing is fast or slow, those are all the things inside that we need to figure out first. If we don't have that figured out, then we can't start to connect the dots of knowing where our body is in space, so we're not bumping into things or tripping. Knowing what steps I need to do in order to complete this task, like teeth brushing. Oftentimes we just see these kids freeze and they just really don't know what their first step is. Okay. And then that next layer up after the motor with the sensory piece is the vision. Okay. Now that I have the senses and the motor, what can I do to really fine tune it? We think of more of those eye-hand coordinations. So not only am I using my hands, I'm using my hand and eyes to manipulate play tasks, whatever is appropriate for my age. We think about a little bit older, reading, what our eyes and our hands are doing together. Okay. And that very top piece is where emotions come in. So whatever comes at us, we're just able to stay calm and cope with it.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a big difference between your base level and all the way up here at your emotions. And I'm assuming that it should be a sequential development from the bottom all the way to the top.
Yeah. And like Geena had talked about earlier about that autopilot piece, really we want that bottom to be so developed that we don't have to think about it, and we can move up to motor skills and academic learning and all of those other things that are asked of kids. Mm-hmm. Whereas if they're not, then we're just stuck at the bottom. But we're being asked to do things at the top. But really where we're functioning is much lower.
So you're missing that whole middle piece.
Yes.
Yeah. It sounds like for these kids that, that if kind of that bottom part is, if there's an issue on the bottom part, then things can be pretty hard as you climb to the top. And when you have a pediatric practice and you work with the pediatric population, it's our job to make things fun and easier and better for certainly the child, but also the family unit. And so how do you go about the treatment aspect? How do you make it fun when it's such a hard or non-preferred thing for these kids?
That's a good question. The kids who we see who have those big cups, that this is the best. Occupational therapy sessions are the most fun. We're in the gym and we're just filling their cup. They're crawling through tunnels and swinging on swings and jumping in the ball pit and finding safe ways to regulate their bodies and make them feel good. But there is that other end of the spectrum where now we have kids in our sessions and we're asking them to do hard things. We're asking them to eat or brush their hair or brush their teeth. So typically what we try to do for them is to desensitize their sensory systems beforehand, grow their cup a little bit, make it a little bit bigger, get their sensory systems ready for then the next thing that we're going to ask of them, which is the hard thing, the brushing the teeth, the clipping the nails, things like that. So we try to prepare their sensory systems first so that they're more tolerant of them when the challenging task is presented to them.
But when both of those children are in front of us, we're looking for that just right challenge. I'm not going to make an ask that's too big that I know it's going to set them up for failure. I'm just going to go little step by little step in order to get to that big goal eventually.
So they still feel good about it. They still feel okay in time and space and willing to give it a try because you've kind of just little by little built upon it.
Erin touched on it earlier. We have to stay calm because if we switch into fight or flight, we're not learning anymore. So that calmness is that really important first piece.
I think parents might hear about sensory processing if they have concerns about an autism diagnosis, but certainly sensory processing can occur for any kid without an autism diagnosis, right?
Yes. I would say most kids that we see have at least one sensory system that could use some help, that could use some strategies or some tools that can help them be more successful with their day. But it's definitely not tied to any specific diagnosis. We all have sensory systems that are working differently.
So Geena, when you have parents come in, what are some of the common complaints or issues that they ask you about?
They come in with a lot of guilt and embarrassment, and they feel really bad. For example, that their child isn't wearing underwear and they think it's their fault. And I love being the person to reassure them and say that, no, they're not crazy and there's a reason for it. And I'm here to help them with the process because there's little steps that we can take to maybe one day wearing that underwear. And it might seem like a really small thing, right? It's a very small example, but everyone has different things that they want their children to achieve. And I really just want to be on a family's team in order for them to have those successes in daily life.
I think another thing I hear a lot too is parents who feel like their kid is like it's all behaviors, and they're frustrated by all of these behaviors and they feel like their kid could, choose to participate in these things. And again, like Geena said, it's nice to be able to reassure them that they're not choosing to fight you on all of these things. Their sensory processing systems are telling them that this is unsafe or, that this is painful to them. So in those ways, it's nice to be able to say, like, this is not your kid trying to just disobey you. They're having problems at another level that we can help with.
Yeah, I think when you don't understand, you're asking kids to regulate their emotions, which is way up there at the top of the pyramid when they're having problems with the bottom part. That makes sense.
And it's a tricky perspective for parents because there's some like, you know what, just figure it out, put your shirt on and let's go. And so to kind of take a step back and have some perspective about how all of that might feel to someone else who's processing it completely differently than you or I would is kind of next level perspective too.
Yeah.
Oftentimes parents have one kind of extreme of sensory processing and their child's the other extreme. So they just don't have the tools to help their child where they're at.
As we wrap up this episode, it sort of sounds like it doesn't actually have to be this hard. The things that are sort of just regular routines at home or the things that you would expect to go easily that aren't going easily shouldn't really be this hard. Any final words or tips for parents?
I just think it's important to ask for help. If you're struggling, it's okay. That's why professionals are out there. So just take that next right step and make a call.
Thanks for joining us today. That was a wealth of really great information that certainly impacts kids and families in a positive way. And we just appreciate the time and energy you put into taking great care of kids.
Yeah, thank you guys for serving kids. I think it's really important for people to know that what you do makes an impact on the rest of their life. So we really appreciate you guys.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I love this topic. It's so fun to talk with parents about. They usually have not heard about it, and it's always fun to give them insight about it.
It's a joy and honor to be a pediatric therapist, and I'm just honored to be along for the ride and helping members of my community.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Unlocking Potential, a Red Door Pediatric Therapy podcast.
Please like and subscribe for more interviews and content, or connect with us online at reddoorpediatric.com.
Thanks for joining us, and remember, communication is key to unlocking your potential.